Recap in minutes. Today we will be going through an action, drama, and war movie from 1957, entitled, Paths of Glory. There will be spoilers ahead in this video, so chill out and enjoy. This classic movie opens in 1916 when an elderly member of the French General Staff, General Georges Brulard, arrives from Paris at the headquarters of his subordinate, General Paul Miraut. He informs him that a major offensive is planned for his sector, and in preparation for this offensive, General George wants Paul's division to capture a well-defended German position, the Ant Hill. Paul hesitates at the idea, claiming that his division is in no condition to capture and defend the Ant Hill. George reluctantly mentions that he was thinking that Paul was due for a promotion, soon to be a fighting general of the 12th Corps. Paul takes a moment to explain that his men mean more to him than any fancy titles or medals. After a long conversation, Paul starts to think that maybe an attack on the Ant Hill could work. George acknowledges him with a smile. The next scene shows Paul inspecting the frontline trenches, accompanied by his loyal and cynical staff officer, Major St. Aubin. As they walk along, Paul stops and asks several soldiers the same question: ready to kill more Germans? Every soldier responds enthusiastically to their general. However, they come across one soldier who remains silent and staring straight ahead. His fellow soldiers explain that he's suffering from shell shock. Paul says there is no such thing as shell shock. Curious about the soldier's state, Paul asks him if he has a wife. The soldier responds that he'll never see her again because he's certain he'll be killed. Hearing this, Paul scolds the soldier for acting like a coward. When the soldier replies that he is a coward, Paul flies into a rage and strikes the soldier across the face, yelling that he wants this little baby transferred out of the regiment. As they continue through the trenches, Colonel Dax, the commander of the 701st Regiment, warmly welcomes General Paul Miraut into his headquarters bunker. He provides the general with a briefing on the intermittent attacks, and then takes him to a vantage point to show him the German positions across the trench. They return to the bunker afterwards. During their conversation, Major St. Aubin makes a disrespectful comment about the enlisted men that offends Colonel Dax. Sensing the tension, Paul asks the major to give them some privacy to discuss the upcoming assault. Paul informs Colonel Dax of his plan to launch an attack on the Ant Hill, for which Dax shows little enthusiasm. Paul criticizes Dax's lack of enthusiasm, and threatens to have him relieved of command if he does not agree to his plan. Not wishing to be taken away from his men, the colonel reluctantly agrees that the 701st Regiment will attempt to take the Ant Hill. That night, Colonel Dax orders Lieutenant Roget to conduct a patrol into no man's land. Corporal Paris is among the two men chosen to accompany the half-drunk Lieutenant Roget on this patrol. The patrol ventures through the hazardous terrain of barbed wire, water-filled shell holes, and general wreckage. At one point, Lieutenant Roget commands the third member of the patrol to scout forward alone, despite Corporal Paris' objections. As they wait for him to return, Lieutenant Roget becomes increasingly nervous, saying he must have been killed. Panicked Lieutenant Roget hurls a grenade into the darkness and hastily retreats to the French lines, leaving Corporal Paris behind. Crawling forward, Paris discovers the lifeless body of the third soldier lying in a shell hole, having been killed by Roget's grenade. A while later, Corporal Paris shows up at Lieutenant Roget's command bunker. The lieutenant acts as if he's happy to see that the corporal is still alive. But Paris confronts him with his crimes: drunk on duty, cowardice in the face of the enemy, and killing a fellow soldier. Lieutenant Roget pretends to be sorry, and points out that a court of inquiry is more likely to believe the word of a lieutenant than that of a corporal. He urges Paris to simply forget about the incident ever happening. At that moment Colonel Dax arrives to pick up the report on the patrol, but Roget states that it isn't finished yet. Dax clearly sees there's something going on between Roget and Paris, but doesn't pursue the matter. The following morning, Dax walks through the trenches where the men of the 701st Regiment are backing against the sides, seeking cover from the incoming artillery barrage. The shells roar overhead and many fall perilously close, showering Dax and his men with clods of dirt and waves of dust. With a whistle between his teeth and a revolver in his hand, Dax blows the whistle and signals his men to go over the top. A mass of French soldiers emerges from the trenches, venturing into the open expanse of no man's land. Carrying heavy packs, with their bayonets fixed, the men move forward as fast as possible. The soldiers begin to fall one by one. The fallen bodies accumulate as the soldiers behind them step over them, only to meet the same fate and join the growing piles. Amidst the chaos and the mud, Dax turns to a nearby sergeant and asks about the whereabouts of the B Company. The sergeant replies that he doesn't know. General Paul, in his observation post, also notices the failure of the B Company to advance. The general flies into a rage, and orders his artillery to commence shelling the trenches occupied by the troops of the B Company to force them to advance. The battery commander refuses to comply with the general's order, and says you have no right to order me to shoot down my own men without an order in writing and signed by the general. Meanwhile, Dax races through the wreckage of his trenches, reaches Lieutenant Roger and B Company. The drunk Roger pleads with Dax that they have already attempted the attack twice and suffered heavy casualties. Ignoring him, Dax climbs a ladder while blowing his whistle, trying to encourage the men to give it another try. Around them, all the soldiers are falling back to their trenches. General Paul is informed in his observation post that the attack has failed all along the line. He instructs Major Saint-Aubin to have the 701st Regiment pulled out of the line, and to assemble a general court-martial, and says if those little sweethearts won't face German bullets, they'll face French ones. The next day, Dax meets with Brulard and Miro at headquarters, where the cynical Miro accuses the entire 701st Regiment of cowardice, and proposes to have 100 men from the regiment randomly executed. Dax strongly objects and General George says they don't want to slaughter the French army, they just want to set an example, to which Dax replies that if it's an example that's needed, the logical choice is the officer most responsible for the attack. George loses his temper and shouts, "This is not a question of officers." Regaining his composure, Brulard suggests that one man from each of the regiment's 3 companies should be chosen to be tried for cowardice. Before they leave, Dax requests to be appointed defense attorney for the accused men and George agrees. Outside in the hallway, General Paul confronts Colonel Dax and virtually orders him to step down as the defense attorney, but the colonel refuses. Miro rails against him for his apparent disloyalty, and threatens to ruin his career when this is over. Now Dax meets with the 3 accused men. They include the intellectual Private Arnaud, who was randomly picked by lot, Corporal Paris, who Lieutenant Roger chose, because he knows what Roger did during the patrol in No Man's Land the night before the battle, and Private Farrell, who was chosen because his company commander considered him to be a social degenerate. Dax explains that the reason they were chosen is irrelevant, since they are all charged with cowardice. He explains that he doesn't have much time, as the trial is that afternoon and he needs to prepare. Dax urges them to show the same courage that they have shown in the face of the enemy. At the chateau, they sit in chairs in front of a group of officers behind tables in a large room. The chief judge of the court-martial begins the proceedings by calling one of the men to testify, but Dax immediately objects, pointing out that the men have the right to hear the charges against them read out. The chief judge replies that the court does not wish to waste time with technicalities, and that basically the charges are that these 3 men showed cowardice in the face of the enemy, and they did not move forward to the German lines. Major Saint-Aubin grills each of the 3 men in turn, with Dax cross-examining them to show that they are not cowards, but all to little avail. The entire trial is a farce. Dax sees his men's rights violated by the cynical military judges. Dax is barred from entering any evidence relating to the case. In his closing argument, Saint-Aubin asserts that the actions of the 701st Regiment were a disgrace to the honor of France. He urges the court to find the accused men guilty, and impose the death penalty as a means of setting an example. Now Dax stands up to protest during his own summation. He says he objects to the fact that he was given practically no time to prepare his case. That the attack by the 701st Regiment on the anthill was no stain on the honor of France, but this trial is such a stain. Dax pleads for mercy, urging the judges to consider the injustice of their actions. The court adjourns to deliberate, leaving the fate of the accused men in their hands. Inside the stable in which they are being held, they consider their options. A priest arrives with news of the verdict. They've all been found guilty and will be executed in the morning. The priest says that he is there to help them, but Arnaud becomes increasingly angry while Paris tries to restrain him. He breaks free and punches the priest. Paris then gets between them and warns Arnaud not to try anything, but Arnaud lunges forward and Paris is forced to slug him. Arnaud stumbles backward, hitting his head on a stone column, and a doctor is summoned. He remarks that Arnaud has a very serious skull fracture, and he may not live through the night. The priest asks whether they intend to execute a man in this condition. The doctor informs him that the death sentence will be carried out, and recommends pinching his cheek to wake him up in the morning. That same night, Captain Rousseau, the battery commander, approaches Colonel Dax and informs him that he possesses crucial information that could greatly impact the court-martial proceedings. After that, he goes straight to see General Brulard, who is attending a lavish ball for general officers and other dignitaries. He privately meets Colonel Dax and Dax confesses that this is not entirely a social visit, and the general protests that he doesn't want to go back over the whole affair of the court-martial. Brulard says perhaps the attack was doomed to fail, but on the other hand, with a little more effort the 701st might have captured the anthill. Attempting to gracefully exit the conversation, Brulard excuses himself to return to the party, and as they walk toward the door, Dax broaches the topic of General Miro's order for the artillery to fire upon their own troops during the attack. Brulard abruptly shuts the door and turns to face Dax, while he continues to describe what happened. Dax presents signed statements from Battery Commander Rousseau, the telephone operator, and his own observations. He highlights the potential consequences if such material were to be made public, and fall into the hands of the press and politicians. Losing his temper, Brulard accuses Dax of attempting to blackmail him. While Dax explains that too much has happened, and someone must be held accountable. General Brulard pauses for a moment with the documents in his hand, looks at him and exits the room. In the next scene, the men of the 701st Regiment stand at attention, lined up on both sides of a path in a huge courtyard. The three condemned men slowly make their way down the path. Arnaud is unconscious and strapped to a stretcher. Finally they reach the post they will be tied to in front of a wall of sandbags. Roger walks forward with blindfolds. Arnaud's stretcher is tilted up against the pole and the sergeant pinches his cheek. Roger marches back to the firing squad, while Major Saint-Aubin comes forward and, in a weak and halting voice, he reads out loud the orders for the execution. Lieutenant Roger shouts out to fire. Later in the chateau over breakfast, Miro expresses his pleasure that the executions went so well. When Dax arrives, Paul compliments him on his men dying well. Angry and disgusted, Dax remains silent. Suddenly, and to Dax's surprise, Brulard mentions to Miro that the colonel had come to him the night before, claiming that during the attack on the anthill, Miro had ordered his artillery to fire on his own men. Miro flatly denies the allegation, but Dax states that he has signed testimony from numerous witnesses. General George warns him that there will be an inquiry. Horrified, General Paul stands up, and shouts at them that they have stabbed a soldier, and storms out of the room. After Miro leaves, George comments that France's armies and military destiny cannot be guided by arrogant fools like General Miro, and he asks Dax how he would like to have General Miro's job. Dax is again taken completely by surprise and replies, "You're offering me General Miro's command?" George responds, Come, my boy, we all know you've been after it from the start." Dax responds angrily that he is a lot of things, but he is not his boy. Brulard becomes furious with Dax and shouts at him that he shall apologize at once for his tone. Dax gets angry with him and refuses any apology. Briefly stunned by Dax's furious and defiant outburst, Brulard slumps back and sighs, now realizing that he was wrong about Dax. The impassive and unfeeling Brulard then ridicules Dax by saying that he is not a soldier but an idealist. For that he pities him and says they are fighting a war. A war they have got to win. Those men wouldn't fight, so he had them shot. Dax says he really doesn't know the reality and he pities him for that. He leaves afterwards. The movie ends when Dax wanders and stands outside a tavern, where he hears men from his regiment having a good time. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe. Recap in minutes for more videos like this, and help the channel grow.